This week on Government Matters.
On this vote, the yeas are 277, the nays are 151. Without objection, the motion is adopted.
With that, Congress funded the federal government for 10 weeks, but there's another shutdown showdown ahead.
This is really about how do we bring data to bear so that it helps to make engaged, empowered consumers.
The strategic plan for federal health IT envisions access to records anywhere, anytime. Now, HHS needs the private sector to buy in.
Many of these large indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts are having a banner year in their revenue and their activities, but I think it's still early in the game.
The Defense Department will use Oasis for a $1 billion contract. We detail the impact on future GWACs. Government Matters starts right now.
From ABC 7 and News Channel 8, this is Government Matters.
To our viewers around the world on the American Forces Network and here in the nation's capital, thanks for joining us. Government is the engine that runs this city. That's why Government Matters. Every week we'll bring you the top headlines in tech, security, and management. I'm your host, Morris Jones. Just hours before deadline, a bitterly divided Congress approved a stopgap spending bill to keep the federal government open. But another shutdown showdown will take place in December. Lana Zach is tracking the path ahead.
Was a bipartisan vote that avoided a shutdown, leaving unchanged the federal funding of Planned Parenthood.
Good leaders have a sense of humility to respect the views of other people and not be condescending in terms of our views are the only ones that matter.
The House had until midnight Wednesday to pass the resolution that earlier in the day made it easily through the Senate.
The Senate has now passed a continuing resolution to keep the lights on, to keep government employees paid, to pay our military, to make sure our veterans get the benefits that they're entitled to.
But several Tea Party Republicans in the House had vowed to vote against a resolution that didn't defund Planned Parenthood.
As long as there is an opportunity before us to defund Planned Parenthood, we should take it.
However, the votes to override a presidential veto just weren't there.
The good news is that it looks like the Republicans will just barely avoid shutting down the government.
Which they did with just hours to spare.
The new Speaker of the House will be elected next week. How that person is able to manage these factions within the Republican Party will all come to a fore in 10 weeks when this all happens again. In Washington, Lana Zach, ABC News.
Let's pick things up there with this week's Management Matters. Joining me, Tony Reardon, president of the National Treasury Employees Union, and Mallory Barg Bulman, managing editor of research at the Partnership for Public Service. Tony, I'd like to start with you. The shutdown was averted, but you blasted Congress anyway. Here's part of a press release your organization issued this week. Financially strapped agencies spent countless wasted hours and resources preparing for a shutdown. That included preparing shutdown plans and providing informal notifications to employees about their work status, a process that had heightened their anxiety and fear. All right, Tony, there's a cost to shutting down the government. There's also a cost to coming close. Tell us more.
Yeah, Morris, you're absolutely right. You know, our government was brought to a shutdown in 2013. And then this year, a couple days ago, we were brought to the brink once again. And now we've put federal employees and the country in a situation where 10 short weeks from now, we're looking at the possibility of another shutdown. And, you know, frankly, that's just no way to treat a workforce. Moreover, we have a situation where the government is really, you know, the American people are kind of losing faith in the American government because, in fact, this is no way to run the business of the most powerful country in this world.
Now, the Office of Personnel Management just released new data from the 2015 Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. Director Beth Colbert touted those numbers on the OPM blog 2 days before Congress passed the stopgap funding measure. Quote, "One highlight in the government-wide results that is especially meaningful for me and other leaders this year is a 1% increase in the Employee Engagement Index score to 64% from 63% in 2014. Mallory, you reviewed those numbers. What do they tell you, and will they take a hit in the year ahead?
Sure. We actually haven't reviewed the numbers yet. In the coming weeks, the partnership will get the data from OPM and begin our process with Deloitte of analyzing the best places to work in the federal government, and I'm really looking forward to seeing those data. I think the early information that we've heard from OPM is really encouraging and exciting. Indeed, we know that leadership matters, and leadership is really a strong predictor of federal engagement. And this administration has put a lot of time and effort into making sure that the senior executives have engagement worked into the performance contracts, that it's a clear expectation. The administration set a cross-agency priority goal of people and culture, making sure engagement is a meaningful part of agencies' operational plans. The other thing that we've seen is within individual agencies, we've seen agencies such as the Department of Labor, the Department of HUD, taking concrete steps to engage their leadership core, making sure that their leadership core takes key steps towards employee engagement. And I'm hopeful once we look at the actual data, we'll really see the same increase.
Well, let's focus on December 11th. Tony, are you optimistic Congress can hammer out a deal before then, or will the government lurch from one fiscal crisis to the next until the next election?
Well, Morris, I can tell you that I'm certainly hopeful. I would not describe it as a situation where I think it will be averted. That remains to be seen. But I can certainly assure you that NTEU is going to be working extremely hard to try to make certain that, in fact, a government shutdown is averted. That's just no way to treat our federal employees, and as I said, it's certainly no way for the government to operate. I think we can, and I think Congress has to do better.
And Mallory, you told FedScoop that leadership can have a big impact on employee engagement and satisfaction. How can agencies harness that power when these budget battles put them at the mercy of a dysfunctional appropriations process?
Sure. I think the appropriations process is certainly a challenge. It provides some difficulties in planning and making sure that the agency is able to have a long-term vision of where it's going, and I think that's really a challenge to leaders. One of the things that we've seen in our analysis is when leaders understand the issues within their agency and have the same understanding as the rest of the workforce, they're better positioned for change. We do an analysis every year that looks at the gap between leaders' perceptions on the employee viewpoint survey and employee views, and we've seen that there's always a gap. That gap doubles when you look at some specific issues around how employees are managed regarding their performance. When leaders take the time to really meet with their workforce, really understand the meaning behind these data, I think we really do have the power to harness change and see improvements within agencies.
Meanwhile, Uncle Sam has bigger fish to fry, like an aging IT infrastructure, an aging workforce, and an outdated hiring process. Tony, can federal workers tackle those types of problems right now? Do they have the bandwidth?
Well, actually, my concern is really around the bandwidth in agencies. The lack of funding in these federal agencies is incredibly poor. And until Congress understands the impact of not providing the funding that these agencies need so that federal employees have the tools and the resources that they need to do their jobs, and frankly that the American people need for them to do the jobs, I got to tell you, I'm concerned about the bandwidth. Just if you look, for example, in the IRS, since 2010 has lost nearly 18,000 employees. That's a tough way to be able to get the work done. And so when we talk about an aging infrastructure, clearly you need employees to help put that infrastructure in place. So I'm not certain that the bandwidth exists.
Tony Reardon and Mallory Barg Bulman, thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was also a big week for cyber on Capitol Hill. Both chambers of Congress hosted some of the nation's top intelligence officials. They did not paint a pretty picture, as Diane Cho reports.
It's no secret the number of cyber attacks by state and non-state actors is growing. But the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Defense says the more troubling aspect is the increased frequency and scale of state-sponsored actors hacking into the U.S. government and business networks.
The recent spate of cyber events that have been in the press, the intrusions into OPM, the Sony and the Joint Staff Networks by 3 separate state actors is not just espionage of convenience, but a threat to our national security.
As a part of the DoD's 2015 cyber strategy, its 3 core missions include defending the DoD's network systems and information and defending the country in what it says are cyber attacks of significant consequence.
It has to include either a loss of life, significant damage to property, serious adverse U.S. foreign policy implications or consequences, or serious economic impact. Now, that's a broad statement, and each of them have to be addressed as an individual act.
Congressman Jim Langevin, a Democrat from Rhode Island, says imposing costs such as economic sanctions on a potential adversary is a critical component of the process in trying to deter future attacks.
Some of our responses may be classified, but others we need to make public so that our enemies know, or adversaries know, that they can't operate with impunity, which is what really is happening right now. It's like the Wild West out there. And they're on the better side of the equation.
In 3 years, the DoD says it plans on creating 133 cyber teams in the Cyber Mission Force, which will be comprised of more than 6,000 civilian and military personnel. One challenge, it can't compete with the private sector in matching salaries. And while a government shutdown was avoided this week, Admiral Michael Rogers, the head of U.S. Cyber Command, says any hint of a possible shutdown could hinder the process.
The workforce is very open with us about, I'm not so sure I want to be part of an organization where there's this lack of control and I can't count on stability. That really concerns me because I can't overcome that.
For Government Matters, I'm Diane Cho.
Let's take a look now at some names making news this week. NASA has a new chief information officer. Renee Wynn spent 25 years at the Environmental Protection Agency and joined NASA in July. She replaces Larry Sweet, who retires next month. Next Gov reports Martha Doris, a 34-year veteran of the General Services Administration, will leave government at the end of October. She's been a strong proponent of customer service in government. In a Facebook post, Doris called it a rewarding career and one she's proud of. Former NSA contractor Edward Snowden is now on Twitter. He joined Tuesday, tweeting, "Can you hear me now?" So far, he's only following one account, NSA.gov. Several years ago, the healthcare sector started making a tectonic shift from paper-based records to a system built and operated in cyberspace. What's the strategic plan for federal health IT? We'll find out straight ahead on Government Matters. In Tech Matters, the strategic plan for federal health IT. The Office of the National Coordinator just released a 5-year approach to help the U.S. achieve high-quality care, lower costs, a healthy population, and engaged individuals. The nucleus of that plan is health IT. Joining me with the latest is Dr. Karen DeSalvo, National Coordinator for Health IT. Karen, let's start with goals. You have 4. Advance person-centered and self-managed health, transform healthcare delivery and community health, foster research, scientific knowledge and innovation, enhance the nation's health IT infrastructure. All of this is very ambitious. Bring everything together for us.
Well, it all comes together at the person. What we want is when you show up at the emergency room or at the doctor's office that you don't have to fill out forms again because the information's there. We want the doctors and nurses and the clinical team to have the information they need to make decisions, to not have to repeat the test and stick you again for the blood. And we want to know that on a Sunday afternoon when you're enrolling your kid in camp that you can get online and get access to your vaccination records for the kids. So this is really about how do we bring data to bear so that it helps to make engaged, empowered consumers who can really have the information there when and where it matters to them. And this plan lays out what the federal government expects to do to see that we can get to that vision, to that future, and how we want to work with the private sector to get there.
Generally speaking, the private sector applauded your strategic plan, but that praise came with a caveat. It is critical that the ONC fast-track work to finalize interoperability standards necessary for capturing and exchanging information across IT platforms. In many respects, these standards are the essential foundation for every strategic goal outlined in the plan. Karen, when do you expect these standards to be finalized?
We have that same sense of urgency that our partners and that, frankly, the American public has, that we advance on this vision, this dream of having a data infrastructure for health and healthcare that we have come to expect in every other sector. With respect to standards, we actually have already now released our second iteration of these standards. In fact, just did this past week, this what we call the Interoperability Standards Advisory, where we are clearly saying to the private sector and other federal partners, here are the standards we all ought to use so that we're working off the same platform, the same vocabulary, so that we're not having to make special interfaces so systems can talk, but that it is as seamless as possible.
As you know, we talked about the shared nationwide interoperability roadmap on Government Matters this February. I'd like to play part of that interview.
Motivating people to participate in that system, to use the standards, to follow the rules of engagement that are part of our governance expectations as a country are going to be a set of motivators and incentives.
All right, Karen, the Defense Department's electronic health records contract was one of the incentives you mentioned. DoD awarded that $4.3 billion contract to Leidos, Cerner, and Accenture Federal in July. How did that award impact your push for shared nationwide interoperability?
You know, Morris, that's one of the most rewarding parts of my job, is to get to work with the DoD and the VA on behalf of soldiers and veterans really all across the globe. The work that they have been doing, the success they've already had, is, I think, a great model for the private sector to keep advancing data availability. Last summer, when the DoD awarded that contract, they were working in close partnership with my office, the Office of National Coordinator, to see that the expectations they had for that electronic health record and for all the health IT systems were aligned with, were the same as where we're going in the strategic plan and in the standards advisory that we released last week, the day after we released this plan. So we are aligned with them. That was a great signal to the marketplace that this is the way that we're going as a federal government, and we want the data for soldiers and veterans to not just work between those two systems, but as they move in and out of the private sector. So we're making great progress.
Karen, let's get back to your 5-year plan. The word flexibility came up a few times. Does anyone know what healthcare will look like 5 years from now? How do you plan for that kind of uncertainty?
Oh, I love that question, because it's something I hear and see a lot when I'm out in the community and talking with consumers in particular. The innovation they expect from better accessible healthcare so that it's on their smartphone, more available through telehealth, is something that we all have an obligation to plan for. And we see that at the National Coordinator's Office, that it's about standards and technology and policy and payment. So we're doing everything we can at Health and Human Services and with our federal partners to create the kind of environment that's going to allow that innovation, that better accessibility, that more consumer-centric kind of care that is going to come in the future. And not knowing exactly what it is, it means that we need to create just a trust environment, an incentive environment, and get us all on a shared set of standards so it's much easier for that kind of innovation to happen.
Wishing you the best with this, Dr. Karen DeSalvo, National Coordinator for Health IT. Thanks.
Thank you, Morris.
We'll turn from tech to security straight ahead on Government Matters. The Department of Defense just made a big investment in Oasis, an acquisition solution run by GSA. We detail the impact on future GWACs next. In security matters, a big financial feather in the Oasis cap. The General Services Administration just awarded a $937 million contract to Booz Allen Hamilton on behalf of the Department of Defense. It will pay for a group of new services under DoD's Global Threat Mitigation Program. For more, I'm joined by Alan Chvotkin, Executive Vice President, the Professional Services Council. Alan, let's start with the basics. Oasis is an acronym for One Acquisition Solution for Integrated Services. So refresh our memories. What is Oasis?
Oasis is one of a family of contracts. They're called Indefinite Delivery, Indefinite Quantity Contracts, IDIQs, awarded by, in this case, the General Services Administration. Multiple winners, and then those winners get the chance to compete for follow-on work, such as what Booz Allen won from the Army in this case.
DoD will save a lot of money by using Oasis. Here's how Jason Miller of Federal News Radio puts it. On this $937 million award, DoD would have paid a fee of more than $7 million under the standard 0.75% fee. But with the agreement for a reduced fee in exchange for a large dollar figure commitment, DoD will pay a fee of just under $1 million, a nice savings that the Pentagon can use toward other needs. Now, if I'm doing my math correctly, that amounts to a $6 million savings. Before Oasis, who earned these fees? What did they pay for, and what do they pay for now?
Well, every one of the large IDIQ contracts run by many agencies, Oasis by the General Services Administration, one by a separate contract by NASA, another one by the Department of Health and Human Services, all charge an administrative fee to the users to pay for the contract performance, the contract administration, and essentially the management of the activity. The General Services Administration, in their largest multiple award contract called their schedules, had a fee to users of 0.75%. When the Department of Defense negotiated with GSA over the use of Oasis, they negotiated a reduced fee. And so in this case, the fee ends up saving DoD $6 million.
All right, Alan, that makes sense. Now, earlier I called this a big financial feather in the Oasis cap. Does it also prove the Oasis model is working?
Well, it certainly does, but it's early in the game. I mean, there are a large number of procurements that have already been awarded under Oasis. Many of these large indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts are having a banner year in their revenue and their activities. But I think it's still early in the game. Early activities just now coming in through these large IDIQ contracts. Question is whether they'll be sustaining power out into the future.
Before you go, talk about the implications. How will this impact future GWACs, Alliant 2, for example?
Well, Alliant 2 is another one of those upcoming awards, and the real issue is, will there be overlap or the extent to which the two are going to be related? I've often said that one of GSA's biggest competitors is GSA. The more of these large IDIQ contracts that they put in place, the greater the ambiguity that they create in the marketplace, the greater the challenge to an agency to select one acquisition contract over another. But these are all have benefits for the agencies, but they also have challenges for the agencies and for the industry.
Alan Chvotkin, Executive Vice President, the Professional Services Council. Thanks again, Alan.
My pleasure.
And that's the latest from Washington. Thanks for watching. I'm Morris Jones. We know your week is filled with other matters. Save this half hour for us.